Hello again, biology. I'm back, part 2 of photosynthesis. So I'm going to start on slide 15 with our question that I left off on last time, which was how does photosynthesis turn CO2 and H2O into something new? In other words, how does photosynthesis use carbon dioxide and water to make something else? Okay. So in this section, I'm going to be doing a deep dive into the actual process of photosynthesis in detail. This means I'm going to be looking at not only just the place that it takes place, but also the process at each step of the way. Okay, so this one, I would suggest you take notes on this section, or at least be prepared to watch certain sections a couple times in order for you to break it down so that you can understand it. I have also provided some diagram sheets for you in the notes section that looks at mine, like what I'm looking at on the screen today, closer, so that hopefully you can see what's happening and you can use those on tests and quizzes that we have coming up here to help you out. Okay, so I'm going to get to the question and get to this here. So how does photosynthesis take carbon dioxide and water and make something else out of it? So if we break down photosynthesis itself, it is made out of two main parts. So there's two reactions that take place during photosynthesis to get us to our end point. There's the first part, which is called the light reaction. Another name for it is the light-dependent reaction. The reason it is called this, dependent, if you think about the word independent, independent means by yourself. Whereas dependent, when you take the in off of it, a dependent means that you need, like you rely on something else. So in this case, a light dependent reaction means that this reaction requires light to happen. Okay, that's the first reaction that happens in photosynthesis. Okay, in this reaction, this produces energy from your sun power, and it makes a different form of energy, which is why it says it produces energy. It basically takes your sun power and turns it into other forms of energy, specifically in the forms of ATP and NADPH. Okay. These two, I know it's going to be confusing for this section because we do use a lot of like shortened terms, like ATP stands for something and so does NADPH. I don't expect you to know the names, like the full names of these. I do expect you to recognize that ATP and NADPH are forms of energy, okay? But in our light reaction, we take the sun's energy and we make other forms of energy in it, okay? Our second part, or second reaction that happens in photosynthesis is called the Calvin cycle, also known as the light-independent reaction. So same, if we look at light-independent reaction, this reaction is independent from light, meaning that this reaction does not require light to happen, okay? So the Calvin cycle, or the light-independent reaction, you can call it either or, happens after the light-dependent reaction. Okay, there's also a third name for this, which is called carbon fixation, or also C3 fixation. These two I don't expect you to know offhand by like memorization. I do expect you to recognize Calvin cycle or light independent reaction. Okay. So what happens in this reaction is we take the energy that we made from our light reaction and we use that energy to make glucose or our sugar. Okay. So those are the two things that happen. First one, light dependent, takes our sun energy, makes other forms of energy that the cell can use, and it uses that energy then to make sugar. Okay. Notice we're concentrating a lot on sugar. Last time we talked about photosynthesis, we said we get both sugar and oxygen out of it. Sugar is our main focus. Oxygen is a waste product in photosynthesis. Okay? I'll probably say that a couple more times. But we're going to concentrate on these two reactions. And I'm going to start with the light independent. Okay? So, in our light dependent reaction, it occurs in the thylakoid membrane. Remember we talked about the thylakoid, each of our little discs, and each of those discs has an outside membrane and an inside space. So our light reaction, our light dependent reaction happens in the thylakoid membrane. Okay, that very first reaction happens here. We use something called the electron transport chain, or the ETC. So in the thylakoid membrane, this process is taking place to generate O2, ATP, and NADPH. Okay? These are the three things we get when we go through the electron transport chain, which is located and being done in the thylakoid membrane. Okay? And I have down here, sorry, at the bottom, you'll notice I have the what each of our forward going terms stand for. So if you see if you see something that says ADP, it stands for the molecule adenosine diphosphate, whereas ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. You'll notice the only difference between ADP and ATP is that di or tri prefix, and I'll try and go over that later, what those look like and why they're called that. And then there's NADP plus, which you'll also see, which is kind of the it's like the precursor to NADPH, and that stands for nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide phosphate. That's what it stands for. Like I said, I don't expect you to know that by heart. Just know that NADP plus is something else you'll see, and it's the thing that comes before NADPH. Okay? So again, like I said, there's going to be lots of words that are like shortened down to make it easier for you to keep track of, even if those like little word shortening things might be confusing. I provided them here so that you understand what they are. ADP and ATP are both, like all those, and NADP plus and NADPH, they're all molecules that are different versions of energy. ADP and NADP plus are less energetic and provide less energy than ATP and NADPH. And so that's the reason why we make ATP and NADPH, is because they have the the ability to provide more energy than the previous two. Okay, so I'm gonna keep going here. Try and wrap your brains around that for a second. They're just pieces of our puzzle and pieces of our process that I'm gonna be going through here. So remember, we're still on the first part, the light reaction. This is still the light-dependent reaction. So what happens in the electron transport chain is we take ADP and we put another phosphate on the end of it to make ATP. Whereas we take NADP plus and we add another hydrogen onto it to get NADPH. Okay. Oxygen comes from splitting your water molecule and not the carbon dioxide molecule. So just letting you know where your oxygen comes from, it comes from us splitting water, not CO2. Okay. And down here we have a reaction that shows you the splitting up of water here into its two components, which is hydrogen and oxygen. Okay. Oh, okay. I'm gonna pause here and bring up my diagram for you guys to look at. Okay. Ooh, excuse me, Herky. All right. So, here is my diagram, which is also your diagram. And so here's the light reaction and what happens. So my mouse pointer. Okay. So we are here's our chloroplast, and like we were talking about, this reaction happens in each of our thylakoid membranes specifically. Okay. And in this picture, we zoom in, and this is the membrane, as you can see, with your little phospholipid bilayer there with its little proteins in between to show that it's a membrane. So this is a close-up of the membrane and what's happening outside of it, which is the stroma, and then inside here leads to the thylakoid lumen, or the thylakoid space. Okay, so here we go. We're gonna break this up here. So we first start out with light hitting our leaf. Okay, and our leaf also takes in water, and at this first protein in the thylakoid membrane, it takes oxygen when it gets this energy, and it breaks it up into these two components, into oxygen and hydrogen. The hydrogen, you'll see, has a little plus. That means that it is a kind of an activated form of hydrogen ready to attach to something else. Okay. When that happens, these hydrogens get kind of separated out, and they're just floating around out here. This oxygen that gets split off is released, and it is breathed out through the stroma. Okay, it doesn't quite show you that, but that's what happens. This oxygen just kind of gets let go and gets breathed out. The hydrogens are kept inside of the thylakoid space to be used later. Out here, sometimes we have leftover H's, which get pulled inside of the thylakoid space because we'd like it to be used. We also get these electrons from this splitting because that is kind of like a form of energy as well. This electron moves down to another, how can I say, another protein, and this protein then, takes that electron and it moves it along to be used when it sees NADP plus, and it uses that energy to add a hydrogen here, could be here or out here, and add it to NADP plus to make it NADPH, okay? And then also we have this other protein in here called ATP synthase. Obviously, synthase sounds like synthesis, which is making. So it's a ATP factory, which takes these H pluses that we have here in the thylakoid space, and it uses them to as a means to help make ADP into ATP. Okay, and then those H pluses kind of hang out here to be pumped back in to go through this cycle of making ATP over and over again. And like I said, we keep getting sunlight and we keep getting electrons and our H pluses again to keep going through this process of making this thing and this thing. This whole box is the ETC. This is the electron transport chain. And the reason we call it that is because, see, these, like I said, these are electrons. They get pushed down this chain, excuse me, over and over again to make these two forms of energy. Okay. In summary, the most important parts to remember in this is that light comes in, splits water so that we can use our hydrogens to make ATP and NADPH. Okay, and then lastly, we breathe or like get rid of the unused oxygen. Okay, so those are the two biggest, those are the things that we want to concentrate on is like going in, splitting water, and then using our hydrogen here to make NADPH, and as well as using it to make ATP. Okay. All right. I'm going to pause it and bring back my other stuff, and move on to the next reaction. All right, we're back. So that is what we just went through is the extent of the light dependent reaction, or the first part, the reaction that needs light. The second part, so after we've gone through the whole mess of making the two types of energy we need, NADPH and ATP, then we move on to the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle occurs inside the space of the chloroplast itself. So this happens in the stroma area. So if you remember the stroma area, I'm going to back up a little bit here. So the stroma was this space inside of the chloroplast, okay? So we were just inside these thylakoid membranes and in the thylakoid, and now we're in the stroma, okay? So that's where this reaction, the Calvin cycle, takes place, is inside the space of the chloroplast called the stroma, okay? It uses the two things that we just made from the first reaction, which is ATP and NADPH, and we're using our carbon dioxide that we breathed in now in this reaction as well, and we're using those three things to make glucose. Okay? And that's the basics of the Calvin cycle. I'll use this later, but I'm going to pause again and go to the next diagram on your notes, on your handout, and explain the Calvin cycle. Okay. Here's the other part of your diagram. It is labeled the light independent or the dark reaction. So this is our second reaction here in diagram form, and let's break that up here. So we're going to start right up here in the top corner where we take carbon dioxide and we take some water and we put it into this huge cycle which has several different reactions in it that build upon themselves, but I'm not going to go over each of those reactions. Just know that this is a bunch of reactions happening in that area of the inside of the chloroplast, okay? So we take our carbon dioxide and some water and we put it into this cycle and we intake ATP and NADPH. And what happens is it actually takes the extra energy from these two molecules and breaks them down into their previously, their lower energy forms. So it kind of like saps the energy that they were carrying and turns them into their older, like less energetic forms. It uses that energy to attach these molecules of carbon together. And at first it's only so it takes carbon dioxide, it takes one of those, it kind of breaks it up into carbon and oxygen, and it slaps carbons together using this energy here. And at first it's only made up out of 3 carbon. And it has to keep going through these reactions of sapping ATP of its extra energy, making it into ADP to slap these carbons together until we get 6 carbons, or like 6 carbon dioxide molecules pushed together. And those 6 together make glucose and sucrose and other forms of sugar. Okay? So the basics of the Calvin cycle is taking in carbon dioxide and a little water and using energy, ATP and NADPH, sucking the extra energy out of them to like connect and stick these carbons together over and over again until you get your end product, which is your 6 carbon dioxide molecules put together to make glucose, sucrose, and other sugars. Okay, that's what the Calvin cycle is all about. All right, I'm gonna, let's see, do I have I have this here, which is your handout. It's kind of tilted for me, but it's on my other slide, so just give me a second and I'm going to go back to that. All right, so we just went over the Calvin cycle. So I'm going to take those two processes and put them together to show you like the whole process of photosynthesis all together. Okay, so this is your other, what am I saying? Your other diagram that you have that I have on your handout, and it shows you both reactions at the same time. It has your chloroplast, which is the whole entire like oval thing here, and we have the thylakoid represented here with the light dependent reaction and the electron transport chain here with ATP synthase here, and we have the Calvin cycle here on the outside of the thylakoid, but still in that chloroplast in the stroma area. Okay, so the way photosynthesis works all together with those two reactions is light comes in, hits the plant cell, and while we have light, we get the splitting of water. Our oxygen gets let go because we don't need it. That's our waste product in the light-dependent reaction. We have these hydrogens that are pulled in, as well as our electrons moving through the chain to provide some sort of energy so that we can take NADP plus and a hydrogen, put them together on this, in this electron transport chain and make NADPH, and that stays floating out here. And then we also use these hydrogens as energy in ATP synthase. As it pumps it out, it uses it as energy to take a phosphate or a phosphorus, and add that to ADP to make ATP, which floats around out here as well. So light dependent reaction right here to make our two forms of energy. Those two forms of energy, since they're out here in the stroma, are used then in the Calvin cycle when it takes our CO2, goes through our reactions of taking our CO2 and using those forms of energy to slap together our CO2 molecules before it gets sugar. Okay, as it uses up this ATP and this NADPH, you'll recognize that that stuff, once it's used, it's floating around out here in the stroma again to be used once again in the light dependent reaction, as long as there's light, to make NADPH and ATP over and over again. You'll notice that the stuff that's made here is used here. The waste products that are made here in the form of NADP plus and ADP are used again in this reaction. It's recycled over and over again to make ATP and NADPH over here, and then it's used here to make sugar. Okay. So that's how photosynthesis works. It goes through this constant process of making these two forms of energy, and then once they use that, use it up here to make sugar. Here is the only place we use water, and once water is broken up, we get rid of our oxygen and use our hydrogens in this process here. Extra H pluses that get pushed out get pumped back in to be used again in here. Okay, I know it may seem complicated, but the overall idea is that we make these two forms of energy to be used in this process, in this reaction, to be used in this reaction to make sugar. Once we use the energy, it's recycled again in this reaction to make more sugar. Okay? Like I said, you can, if you print these handouts out, make sure to make notes on them, labeling out the process and the main points that are happening in each of these reactions. Okay? And that is the basics of the, well, that's the more detailed look at photosynthesis, what's happening, what we're making, what we're getting rid of, and what's the overall goal. Okay? I know there's going to be questions on this, so please don't hesitate to ask me for help. And I can try and go back through this and try and find some videos that make it a little easier to understand if my explanation isn't making it clear enough. Okay? All right. I'm going to end it there. I'll be back next time with cellular respiration, and we start to get to talk about us in all of this and not just plants. Okay? Alrighty. I'll talk to you all later. So yeah, bye biology.